Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now get comfortable and let's begin. The letter of appointment arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the maples along Federal Street had turned the color of dried blood, and the first killing frost had silvered the lawns of the old colonial houses. I had been cataloging water-damaged manuscripts in the basement of the Orne Library for 3 years, a position that paid barely enough to keep my rented room on Pickman Street heated through the Massachusetts winters, when Professor Armitage's recommendations secured me the custodianship at the Institute. The Miskatonic University Institute of Oneiric Studies occupied a narrow brownstone on Crane Street, wedged between a shuttered millinery shop and the offices of a maritime insurance concern that had seen better days before the crash of '29. You would pass it without notice unless you knew to look for the brass plate beside the door, green with verdigris, bearing only the initials IOS and a curious symbol that might have been a horn or might have been an eye, depending on the angle of afternoon light. Dr. Wayland Dyer, who would become my supervisor and wake handler, met me in the foyer. He was a thin man of perhaps 50, with the pallor of someone who spent too many hours in windowless rooms and the precise movements of a watchmaker. The foyer itself was unremarkable: dark wood paneling, a Persian runner worn thin at the center, the smell of pipe tobacco and old paper that permeates every academic building in New England. But the air carried something else, a quality I couldn't name then but would come to recognize, the particular staleness that accumulates in spaces where too many people have dreamed too deeply. "Mr. Thorne," Dyer said, his handshake dry and brief, "your references speak highly of your discretion and your facility with damaged texts. Both qualities will serve you here." He led me up a narrow staircase that creaked at the 3rd and 7th steps. I would learn to count them in the dark, to the 2nd floor where the primary archives were housed. The collection room stretched the length of the building, lit by tall windows that faced north onto a brick wall 6 feet away. Iron radiators clanked and hissed beneath the sills. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelves of bound volumes, their spines labeled in a classification system I didn't recognize, combinations of astronomical symbols, Arabic numerals, and what might have been cuneiform. 3 long tables occupied the center of the room, their surfaces marked by decades of ink stains and the circular ghosts of countless teacups. "Your contract," Dyer said, producing a folder from a locked drawer. The terms were unusual but not unreasonable. A salary half again what I'd earned at the library, board provided in the Institute's 3rd-floor apartments if desired, and access to the university's medical services. The obligations were more peculiar. I would maintain strict confidentiality regarding all materials handled. I would submit to nightly logging procedures. I would comply with what the contract termed anchor protocols without deviation. I would keep a detailed sleep diary for the duration of my employment. I would consent to observation during induced sleep states when required by research needs. I hesitated at that last clause. Dyer noticed. "The Institute's work concerns the documentation and analysis of Oneiric phenomena," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Dreams, Mr. Thorne, though that word barely encompasses what we study here. Your primary duties will be archival, matching entries, verifying provenance, maintaining the indices, but given the nature of the material, certain participatory elements become necessary. Nothing harmful, I assure you, merely observation and recording. The salary would clear my debts and allow me to send money to my sister in Portland, whose husband had been killed in a mill accident the previous spring." I signed. Dyer walked me through the collection. The bound volumes contained dream journals dating from 1671 to the present, some in English, others in Dutch, German, French, Latin, and scripts I couldn't identify. One section held electroencephalograph recordings from the university's medical college, long scrolls of paper marked with the jagged lines of sleeping brains. A locked cabinet contained what Dyer called the gate logs, reports of subjects who had been observed in their beds, breathing steadily,
while witnesses swore they had seen them active elsewhere in the building or the town. "Your first assignment," Dyer said, pulling 4 leather-bound ledgers from a shelf marked with a horn symbol in red wax. "Cross-reference these volumes. Look for recurring phrases, images, or narrative sequences. Flag any exact duplications. We're particularly interested in what we call persistence events, identical descriptions appearing across different dreamers, separated by significant spans of time or distance." I spent the first week immersed in those ledgers. The earliest was the dream diary of one Jeremiah Orne, a Salem merchant who had fled to Arkham during the witch trials. His cramped handwriting, faded brown with age, described visions of a plaza surrounded by 7 black pillars under a starless sky. The second ledger belonged to a Kingsport sailor named Elias Marsh, dated 1723. The third was the journal of a Miskatonic professor of mathematics, Lucius Bellingham, from 1854. The fourth and most recent came from a patient at the Arkham Sanitarium, one Margaret Tillinghast, committed in 1929 after she was found walking barefoot through the November snow, speaking in tongues. By the third day, I had begun to notice patterns. Certain phrases appeared verbatim across the centuries. The weight of starless void, 7 pillars marking cardinal points that have no earthly correlation, the sound like breathing through stone. But what stopped my pen mid-notation was the discovery of entire sentences, 33 of them repeated character for character across all 4 journals, despite differences in handwriting, spelling conventions, and even language in their surrounding text. I documented each recurrence meticulously: page number, line position, context. The 33 sentences weren't sequential. They scattered through the texts like islands in a dark sea. But when I arranged them in the order they appeared in Orne's journal, they formed a coherent narrative, instructions for approaching something called the Dais of Record by way of the Horn Path. I submitted my variance report on a Friday afternoon. The light through the north windows had taken on the amber quality that presages snow, and the radiators had fallen silent. The Institute's ancient boiler required daily coaxing after the first freeze. Dyer read my report while I waited, his expression unchanging. When he finished, he unlocked another drawer and withdrew a carved wooden box. Inside, nested in faded velvet, lay a collection of objects that seemed to belong to no particular tradition I knew. Rings carved from what might have been bone or horn, inscribed with symbols that hurt to examine directly. Metal discs the size of silver dollars, their surfaces bearing an ivory-colored inlay that formed patterns suggesting mathematics I couldn't parse. Braided cords of varying lengths, each tagged with a paper label. Return leash, 7 count. Return leash, 13 count. Return leash, 27 count. "You will select 1 token by lot," Dyer said, producing a velvet bag. "Wear it during all sessions. Keep a sleep diary for 14 cycles. I will serve as your wake handler." I reached into the bag and drew out a ring of yellowed horn, warm to the touch despite the chill in the room. The moment it settled on my finger, I felt, how can I describe it, a shift in the weight of the air, as if barometric pressure had suddenly dropped. The sensation passed quickly, but left me with the peculiar feeling that the room's dimensions had subtly altered, though measuring would have proven nothing changed. "From now on," Dyer said, logging my selection in a leather-bound register, "you will record your dreams immediately upon waking. Use the forms provided: date, duration, key images, emotional tenor, and any phrases that seem significant. Pay particular attention to repetitions, either within your own dreams or echoing the materials you've studied." He assigned me quarters on the 3rd floor, a small but comfortable room with a narrow bed, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, and a wardrobe that smelled of cedar and something else, something like the air in caves. The wallpaper, a William Morris pattern of intertwined vines, had been patched in several places with pieces that didn't quite match, as if sections had been cut away and replaced. That first night I filled out the pre-sleep form.
date, time of retirement, physical condition, mental state, last meal consumed. I noted the train whistle that sounded at 11:47, the way frost was forming on the inside of the window glass, the weight of the horn ring on my finger. I lay down, expecting the usual fragmentary dreams or perhaps nothing at all. I had never been one to remember my dreams clearly. What came instead was vivid, as waking life and twice as heavy with significance. I stood in a plaza paved with stone that reflected no light, surrounded by 7 pillars that rose beyond sight into darkness. The air tasted of copper and salt. In the center of the plaza sat a dais of the same light-drinking stone, and upon it rested an open ledger thick as a cathedral Bible. I approached, my footsteps making no sound, and saw that the pages were covered with handwriting, my own handwriting, though I had never written these words. The dream lasted by the clock's measure, 4 hours and 17 minutes. But within it, I experienced what felt like days of examination, copying passages from the great ledger into a smaller book that materialized in my hands. When I woke, my fingers ached as if I had indeed spent hours writing, and the pre-dawn light through the frost-covered window seemed wan and false after the absolute darkness of that plaza. I filled out the post-sleep form with trembling hands. When I reached the section for phrases of significance, my pen moved without conscious direction, writing, Plaza, 7-pillar locus, approach by Horn Path Eastern, dais elevation 3 steps of unequal height, ledger consultation requires witness state, return count initiates at 13. Dyer arrived within minutes, though I hadn't rung for him. He read my form, compared it to a reference sheet he produced from his jacket, and made a notation in his register. First passage confirmed. Horn path navigation successful. Subject displays expected automatism on set. Automatism, I asked, though my tongue felt thick and foreign in my mouth. The technical term for what you've experienced, your handwriting without conscious volition. It's one of the markers we track. Notable that it manifested on your first night. Your compatibility with the material appears to be exceptionally high. He showed me his reference sheet. There, in handwriting I recognized from the 1723 Sailor's Journal, were the exact phrases I had just written, down to the punctuation. Over the following nights, the dreams grew more elaborate and more persistent. I would find myself not just in the plaza, but walking the paths between the pillars, each leading to different locations that corresponded to nothing in waking geography. A stairwell that descended through green-tinged darkness to a depth where pressure made breathing difficult. A bridge of what looked like glass but felt like flowing water under my feet. Spanning a chasm from which rose sounds like distant orchestral music played in reverse. A circular courtyard where the air itself seemed to have crystallized into geometric patterns that shifted when observed directly. By the 4th night, my sleep diary had begun to fill itself. I would wake to find pages covered in my handwriting, describing experiences I only partially remembered. Dyer marked these passages with different colored inks, red for first appearances, blue for recurrences, green for variations, black for what he termed anomalous insertions. You're displaying remarkable consistency, he told me after reviewing a week's worth of entries. Most subjects require months to achieve this level of detail and clarity. We're going to advance you to paired sessions. Paired sessions, he explained, involve 2 or more custodians attempting to reach the same Oneiric location simultaneously. If successful, they would not only visit the same place in their dreams, but would be able to perceive each other there, exchange information, and verify their experiences upon waking. It was, he said, one of the Institute's most significant discoveries, proof that certain dream spaces had objective existence independent of the individual dreamer. My partner for these sessions would be Philip Marbury, a thin, nervous man in his 30s who had been with the Institute for 3 years. He wore an ivory disc on a chain around his neck and had the habit of touching it reflexively every few minutes, as if reassuring himself it was still there. His specialty was what the Institute called ivory paths, routes through dream space that required different tokens than the horn paths I had been traveling. We prepared for our first paired session on a night when sleet rattled against the windows and the radiators clanged like ship's bells. Dyer positioned our beds 6 feet apart in the archive room, reasoning that proximity to the materials might strengthen the connection. Marbury and I synchronized our watches, reviewed our target location, the 7-pillared plaza, and spoke the door words in unison. I witness. I do not contract. The transition came faster than before, a sudden drop like missing a step in the dark. I found myself in the plaza, the 7 pillars rising around me like the bars of an impossible cage. And there, approaching from the opposite direction, was Marbury. Not a dream image of Marbury, but somehow the man himself, his consciousness pressed into this space like a seal into wax. He raised his hand in greeting, and I saw that his ivory disc glowed faintly in the non-light of that place. "Can you hear me?" he asked, and his voice carried undertones I had never heard in waking life, harmonics that suggested vast distances and impossible geometries. "Yes," I replied, and felt my own voice take on similar qualities. "The plaza is stable. The dais is present. The ledger—" But before I could finish, a figure emerged from behind the central pillar, tall, wrapped in something that might have been cloth or might have been shadow, with features that refused to resolve into anything fully human. It carried a book bound in what looked like sheets of compressed ash, and when it spoke, the words seemed to bypass my ears entirely and etch themselves directly onto my consciousness. "New witness," it said, "Horn Pathwalker, your name is already written." It opened the ash-colored book, and I saw pages covered with entries in my handwriting, not just what I had written in my sleep diary, but entries dated weeks, months, years into the future. My name appeared again and again, followed by descriptions of places I had never seen, conversations I had never had, choices I had never made. "The ledger bearer," Marbury whispered beside me, "don't accept anything it offers. Don't agree to anything. We only witness." But the figure had already extended the book toward me. "Your signature," it said, indicating a blank line at the bottom of a page, "to confirm the accuracy of what will be." I felt my hand rising, moving toward the book without my volition, the same automatism that had filled my sleep diary now pulling me toward this moment of commitment. Marbury grabbed my wrist, his touch shockingly cold even in that space where temperature had no meaning. "Return count," he said urgently. 13, 12, 11. I joined him, forcing the numbers through lips that wanted to speak other words. 10, 9, 8. The plaza began to dissolve, the pillars wavering like reflections in disturbed water. The ledger bearer remained solid, watching us with what might have been disappointment or might have been patience, the kind of patience that could wait centuries for the right moment. 7, 6, 5. My fingers brushed the ash book's binding, and knowledge flooded through me. Not words or images, but pure understanding. The comprehension that all dreams were connected, that certain paths ran beneath the surface of sleep like veins beneath skin, and that someone, something, required witnesses to keep those paths open, to prevent them from either closing forever or opening too wide. 4, 3, 2. The sensation shattered. I gasped, choking on air that tasted of copper and electricity, and found myself on the narrow bed in the archive room, Dyer's hands on my shoulders, shaking me fully awake. Beside me, Marbury writhed in his own bed, speaking numbers in a language that predated human speech. 1, I finished, and felt something snap back into place, like a dislocated joint returning to its socket. Dyer helped me sit up, check my pulse, shone a pen light in my eyes. "Successful contact," he said, making notes. "Visual confirmation of partner, verbal exchange achieved, entity encounter." He paused, looking at my expression. "You saw the ledger bearer." It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "And it offered you something." Again, a nod, "But you refused." "Good, That's essential, especially this early in your conditioning. The entities will test new witnesses, probe for weakness or excessive curiosity. Your restraint is noted and approved. He showed me the readings from the session, brain waves, heart rate, galvanic skin response, all recorded on long strips of paper that would be filed with thousands of others in the Institute's basement archives. But what caught my attention was a photograph he had taken during the session, showing Marbury and me in our beds. Above each of us, barely visible but undeniably present, hung a shadow that suggested vast height and uncertain geometry, as if something from the dream had partially manifested in the waking world. Bleed through, Dyer explained. It happens during particularly intense sessions. Don't be alarmed, the barriers hold, they always have. But that night, as I lay in my third-floor room listening to the sleet turn to snow, I wondered about those patches in the wallpaper, those places where something had been cut away. I thought about the 33 sentences repeated across centuries, about the ledger-bearer's book with my future already written, about the paths beneath sleep that required witnesses to remain stable. And when I finally drifted off, the horn ring warm on my finger, I dreamed of archive rooms stretching infinitely in all directions, filled with the sleep diaries of everyone who had ever closed their eyes and descended into darkness, searching for or fleeing from something that had always been waiting at the bottom of consciousness, patient as stone, inevitable as gravity. The next morning, I found my sleep diary filled with coordinates. Green stairwell, northwestern approach, depth approximately 700 steps, count varies. Gate mechanism requires dual tokens for stability. Warning, counterfeit paths proliferate near the 93rd step. Verify by checking for moss growth on left wall. True path has none below the waterline. I had no memory of writing these instructions, but when I compared them to maps Dyer later showed me, charts drawn by custodians dating back to the Institute's founding in 1919, they aligned perfectly with routes that had taken others months to discover. Dyer moved me to accelerated conditioning after reviewing the overnight pages. The pace would increase, he warned. The sessions would grow longer, the entities more persistent, the boundaries between sleeping and waking more negotiable. But the work was essential. The Institute had a duty, he said, to maintain certain continuities, to ensure that specific passages remained documented and witnessed, to prevent unauthorized openings that could destabilize more than just individual minds. I accepted the acceleration. By then, the horn ring had worn a permanent indentation in my finger, and my dreams had begun to feel more real than the gray December days I spent cataloging impossible experiences. The wallpaper's patches no longer troubled me. I understood, now that they marked places where the bleed-through had grown too visible, where previous custodians had seen too much of what lay beneath the surface of things. But understanding and accepting are different creatures entirely, as I would learn in the sessions to come. The Institute's work was indeed essential, but not in the way Dyer had implied. We were not maintaining continuities, we were being maintained by them, kept as living anchors for paths that should never have been walked, witnesses to transactions that predated human consciousness but required human documentation to remain binding. The horn ring grew heavier each day, though the scale showed no change in weight, and my sleep diary continued to fill itself with instructions for journeys I couldn't remember taking, each entry signed with my name in handwriting that grew less and less recognizable as my own. The formation of our 4-custodian cell came in January, when ice sheathed the telephone wires along Crane Street, and the Institute's furnace struggled against a cold that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. Carmen Ortiz arrived from the University of Buenos Aires, where she had been studying indigenous dream-walking traditions among the Mapuche. She wore both horn and ivory tokens on a chain of braided silver, the only custodian authorized for dual-token work without supervision. Her English carried traces of Castilian precision, and she had a habit of sketching geometric patterns in the margins of her notes, patterns I recognized from the walls of the glass bridge. Kerr had been with the Institute since 1931, recruited from the Massachusetts Maritime Academy after he reported experiencing navigational displacement during a storm off Georges Bank. His ship had arrived at port 7 hours before it departed, according to all instruments and witnesses. He served primarily as wake handler, but had developed an emergency anchoring ability that had saved 3 custodians from what the Institute termed terminal drift. His hands bore scars from holding return leashes that had grown hot enough to burn. Our workspace migrated to the basement, where the Institute had constructed what they called the cartography room. The north wall held a massive corkboard, covered in colored threads, pins, and photographs, a 3-dimensional map of dream space as we understood it. Red threads marked horn paths, blue for ivory, green for crossable zones. Black pins indicated counterfeit gates, zones where the familiar twisted into trap. Photographs showed not the places themselves, no camera could capture what existed beyond sleep, but the physical effects on those who had walked there. Bruises in impossible patterns, premature graying of hair in perfect spirals, eyes whose pupils had developed secondary rings. The rotation schedule Kerr developed was punishing, but necessary. Each night one of us would enter deep transit, while another attempted remote observation from a different anchor point. The third would monitor from waking, ready to pull the return leash at the first sign of deviation. The fourth prepared what we called capture tables, sheets of butcher paper gridded and numbered, ready to receive whatever information spilled out upon return. We synchronized our watches to the second and spoke our door words in measured cadence, turning the process into ritual through repetition. My first validation with Marbury at the 7 Pillars succeeded beyond protocol expectations. I approached from the horn path, feeling the familiar sensation of stone that absorbed all light, while he came via ivory, describing later a route through what he called the moth-wing corridor, where the air itself felt fibrous. When we met at the central pillar, our synchronized watches showed identical times down to the second. We exchanged predetermined phrases, his, "The architect sleeps beneath," mine, "But the blueprint wakes," and both recorded seeing our reflections in the pillar's surface, though the stone gave back no light in any spectrum we could name. The glass bridge proved more difficult. The approach required a full hour of descent through the green stairwell, counting each step to maintain orientation. At step 93, as my sleep diary had warned, a counterfeit path opened to the left, promising shorter passage. The moss on the walls grew in reverse here, spreading downward from an invisible waterline, and the sound of running water came from above rather than below. I pressed against the right wall and continued counting. At step 460, the stairwell opened onto a platform of weathered boards that creaked with stellar cold. The bridge itself defied perception. Glass, yes, but glass that flowed like water while remaining solid underfoot. Transparent yet revealing nothing below except a depth that made vertigo seem like a comfort. Ortiz met me at the center, having arrived through what she called the sine wave passage, a route that required walking in a pattern that described a mathematical function. We spoke our validation phrases, and she showed me something that hadn't appeared in any prior report. Beneath the flowing glass, shadows moved in formation, processing along their own bridge that existed below or beside or through ours. "They don't see us," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that the glass amplified into near music. "But they're walking the same path, just displaced along an axis we can't access." We added this observation to our charts, marking the glass bridge as a point of dimensional overlap. Kerr suggested the shadows might be other custodians from other institutes, for surely if Arkham had developed these techniques, others had done the same. But Dyer, reviewing our reports, proposed a different theory. They were us, walking the same paths in iterations of time that didn't quite align, creating a kind of temporal palimpsest. The plain gate presented its own challenges. Unlike the elaborate approaches required for other anchors, the plain gate could be reached simply by walking forward in any dream, maintaining absolute neutrality of thought until surroundings simplified to a single wooden door in a wall of unpainted plaster. But this simplicity was deceptive. The door's handle was always exactly where your hand expected it to be. The wood grain always ran in the direction your eyes wanted to follow. The threshold always stood at the precise height your foot anticipated. It shaped itself to expectation, and therein lay its danger. Marbury discovered this when he attempted a solo validation. He found the door exactly as described, opened it with the ease of entering his own room, and stepped through into a space that resembled the Institute's archive room, but wrong in every particular. The books were shelved spine inward. The windows looked out onto a city that had never existed, and seated at the central table was a figure that wore his face, but whose movements lagged a half-second behind his own, like a reflection struggling to keep pace with its source. "I tried to speak the return count," he told us afterward, pale and shaking over a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "But it spoke the numbers first, in my voice, and I found myself following along, counting in reverse. If Kerr hadn't pulled the leash when my vital signs spiked." We marked the plain gate with a yellow pin, accessible but requiring extreme caution. No one would attempt it alone again. The identification of recurring figures became our next priority. Across centuries of ledgers, certain entities appeared with enough consistency to suggest they weren't projections or symbols, but autonomous inhabitants of dream space. The ledger bearer we had already encountered. The Dais Ward appeared at sites of documentation, a figure wrapped in what looked like typewriter ribbon, speaking only in questions that had to be answered with questions. The Circle Keeper manifested exclusively at the Circle Court, which we had been ordered to avoid. Descriptions portrayed it as a child-sized figure whose face was a constantly renegotiating contract written in scripts that predated human writing. We developed protocols for entity encounters. Never accept offered objects. Never sign anything. Respond to questions with the phrase "I witness," followed by precise description of what we observed. Record all exchanges verbatim, even if the words resisted transcription or tried to change themselves on the page. Most importantly, never make promises or agree to future meetings. The entities seemed bound by rules of contract and obligation that we didn't fully understand. Testing for artifacts, objects or marks that crossed from dream to waking, yielded disturbing results. After a session at the spiral pit, where I had descended a structure that corkscrewed through what felt like geological strata of compressed time, I woke to find my horn ring bearing an indentation in the shape of a shard or tooth. The mark hadn't been cut or pressed. The horn itself had reformed, its molecular structure rearranged to accommodate this new shape. Ortiz experienced something similar, but more disturbing. After walking the plain gate's peripheral corridors, she found her ivory disc had developed concentric scoring on its surface, circles within circles that seemed to rotate when viewed peripherally. But what troubled her more was that she remembered making these marks, remembered using her fingernail to inscribe each circle during the dream, though her nails showed no wear, and the ivory was far too hard to mark by such means. "It's as if the memory came with the mark," she said, turning the disc over and over in her hands, like the artifact carried its own history across the boundary. We photographed everything, measured and weighed and compared to historical records. An 1838 ledger showed an identical shard mark on a horn ring. A 1909 patient's sketch perfectly matched Ortiz's scored disc. The artifacts weren't random, they were recurring, perhaps accumulating, each mark adding to a pattern that spanned centuries. The mathematics of recurrence revealed its own unsettling consistency. Kerr, who had a head for numbers, calculated probability distributions for phrase appearances across the archive. The 7 pillar phrases appeared in 27% of all records, regardless of era or custodian. Glass bridge descriptions held steady at 14%, plain gate encounters 30%, but counterfeits False paths that led to dissolution or worse clustered at 19%, with 73% of those centered on something called the broken colonnade. It's like looking at a city map, Kerr said, pointing to his calculations spread across 3 tables. These percentages are too consistent to be random. Something is maintaining these proportions, keeping the paths in balance. We refined our detection methods. Counterfeit gates often presented familiar phrases with single words altered. 7 pillars became 7 anchors. Return count became reform count. The changes were subtle enough to pass unnoticed in the dream state's fluid logic. Kerr developed a mnemonic routine. If a gate's phrase varied even slightly from the index, we would speak the inverse count immediately, breaking the sequence before it could take hold. If our hands began writing autonomously, we would break the stroke before the final letter, forcing the compulsion to reset. The Ledger Dais session required all 4 of us. Marked in 3 centuries of records as a place where documentation itself was documented, where the act of witnessing was witnessed in turn, it could only be reached through simultaneous approach from multiple anchors. We spent a week in preparation, memorizing abort phrases, conditioning ourselves to maintain awareness even in deep transit. On the night of February 3rd, with snow falling so thick that the street lamps were reduced to dim halos, we arranged ourselves in the cartography room. I would approach through the horn path, Marbury through ivory, Ortiz through the sine wave passage she had mastered, and Kerr would maintain watch while keeping a finger on each of our return leashes, ready to pull us back at the first sign of deviation. The approach took longer than expected. The 7 pillars were there, but between them the space had thickened, requiring effort to push through. The familiar plaza had developed weather, not wind or precipitation, but a kind of temporal pressure, as if time itself had become viscous. Each step forward aged me, each step back restored youth, creating a nauseating oscillation that only stabilized when I stopped trying to maintain linear progress and allowed myself to move in the spiral pattern the space demanded. The dais rose from the plaza's center, but it wasn't empty. The ledger bearer stood beside it, and on the dais itself sat a stone ledger the size of a cathedral Bible, its pages made of what looked like compressed ash but felt like the memory of paper. The book was already open, showing entries in dozens of hands, some of which I recognized from our archives, others in scripts that seemed to predate human writing, yet remained somehow legible. "Witness," the ledger bearer said, and its voice carried the weight of accumulated documentation, centuries of recorded dreams pressing against my consciousness. "The junction requires authentication." Marbury arrived from the left, moving through ivory light that clung to him like fog. Ortiz materialized from above, descending a staircase that existed only as she stepped on it. We formed a triangle around the dais, maintaining the positions our protocol demanded. The stone ledger's pages turned of their own accord, revealing entries in my own handwriting, not just recent sessions but accounts of dreams I hadn't yet experienced, dated weeks and months into the future. One entry, dated March 15th, described a place called the Inverse Cathedral, where architecture existed as negative space and sound traveled backward through time. Another, from April, detailed an encounter with something called the Latitude Keeper, whose function was to maintain the angles at which realities intersected. "Sign," the ledger bearer commanded, indicating a blank line at the bottom of the current page. Above it, in fresh ink, was written, "Witness to junction, authentication pending." Protocol was clear. We could observe, record, describe, but never sign anything not validated by the Institute. Yet as I looked at that blank line, I felt the familiar tug of automatism, my hand rising toward the pen that had materialized in my fingers. "Inverse count," Marbury said sharply. 13, 12, 11. But the numbers felt wrong here, like trying to speak underwater. The ledger bearer didn't move, didn't react, simply waited with the patience of stone. The pages continued to turn, showing more future entries, more dreams undreamed, more paths unwalked, And there, near the end, an entry that stopped my breath. March 30th, terminal transit. The witness accepts the function, the gates stabilize, the institute dissolves. Ortiz grabbed my wrist, her touch shocking in its solidity. We're leaving. Now. But leaving wasn't simple. The return path had multiplied, each pillar now opening onto dozens of possible routes. Some led back to the cartography room, others to places we had no names for. The ledger bearer spoke again, its voice now multiform, as if every custodian who had ever stood at this dais was speaking through it. The junction remains open. Without authentication, the paths will seek their own witnesses. The untrained will be recruited. The gates will walk into waking. I understood then what our work truly was. We weren't documenting dreams. We were containing them, maintaining boundaries that kept certain possibilities from manifesting in the waking world. Every recorded path was a path controlled. Every witness gate was a gate that couldn't open randomly into unprepared minds. "Show us the true return," Ortiz demanded, and her authority with dual tokens gave her words weight the space recognized. The ledger-bearer gestured to a pillar we hadn't seen before. An eighth pillar, impossible given the plaza's geometry but undeniably present. Through it, we could see the cartography room, Kerr pulling on our leashes, Dyer rushing down the stairs with a medical kit. We moved toward it, but I couldn't resist looking back. The stone ledger remained open on the dais, that blank line still waiting. And I knew with the certainty that comes only in dreams that one day someone would sign it. The mathematics of recurrence guaranteed it. If not me, then another custodian, in another year, in another iteration of the same eternal approach. The return hit like surfacing from deep water. Kerr was shouting numbers, Dyer was checking pupils and pulse, and my hands were already writing, filling the capture tables with coordinates and descriptions that my waking mind could barely comprehend. When I finally stopped, 17 pages lay before me, covered in diagrams of spaces that couldn't exist, equations that described the angles at which dreams intersected with reality, and over, a single phrase: the junction remains open. In my hands, my own ledger had manifested a new page, blank except for a single line at the bottom, waiting for a signature. Kerr photographed it, tagged it red for maximum caution, and locked it in the safe reserved for objects that had demonstrated agency. The weeks that followed brought an escalation in what we termed waking bleed. University students reported sharing dreams of the 7 pillars. A professor of mathematics woke to find his blackboard covered with equations describing the sine wave passage, though he had no memory of writing them. 3 separate households on Federal Street complained of a sound like breathing through stone that came from their cellars at precisely 3:17 a.m. The Institute's response was to intensify our mapping efforts. We had to understand the topology of dream space well enough to predict where breaches might occur, to reinforce the boundaries before they failed. Dyer brought in specialists from the mathematics department to analyze our data, but they lasted only days before requesting reassignment. One left a note: "These patterns suggest a geometry that thinking about too deeply constitutes a form of travel." My own condition was deteriorating or evolving, depending on perspective. The autonomous writing now occurred even while awake. I would be cataloging entries and find my hand had filled 3 pages with descriptions of places I'd never visited, conversations with entities I'd never encountered. The horn ring had developed 3 more shard marks, each corresponding to a location on our map that I had no memory of visiting. "You're becoming bound," Dyer told me during one of our mandatory psychological evaluations. "It happens to some custodians, the ones with the highest compatibility. The boundaries between your waking consciousness and dream awareness are thinning. Soon, you'll be able to navigate dream space without fully sleeping. But the cost..." He trailed off, looking at records I wasn't authorized to see. 5 previous bound witnesses in our archives. None lasted more than a year before requesting isolation or experiencing what we term terminal integration. What happened to them? They're still writing, he said quietly. Even the ones who died decades ago. Their ledgers continue to fill themselves, documenting dreams that have no dreamer, paths that have no walker. We keep them in the sub-basement, in rooms that no one enters anymore. Sometimes, late at night, you can hear the pens scratching. It was then that I understood why the wallpaper in my room had those patches, why certain areas of the Institute were sealed, why the building itself felt heavy with accumulated dreams. We weren't the first to walk these paths, and we wouldn't be the last. The Institute was itself a kind of anchor, a physical space where dream and waking had grown so entangled that separation was no longer possible. The final session of our cell's operation came on February 28th. We had detected an unindexed gate, something that appeared in no historical record, manifesting at coordinates that our mathematics suggested were impossible, a location that existed only when approached simultaneously from all known anchors. The Institute's director, Dr. Armitage himself, authorized the attempt under strict conditions: full quorum, all available abort protocols, and if anyone showed signs of terminal integration, immediate cessation regardless of research value. We prepared for 3 days, memorized new return counts in languages that predated speech, practiced breaking our own automatism, literally tying our writing hands
When necessary, Kerr constructed an elaborate system of leashes and pulleys that could extract all 4 of us simultaneously if needed. Dyer stationed himself at the controls, while Armitage observed from behind reinforced glass, a precaution that seemed theatrical until I remembered the photographs of previous sessions, the shadows that had partially manifested above sleeping bodies. As we lay down on our cots, I noticed that my horn ring had begun to warm, a steady heat that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Marbury's ivory disc was doing the same, glowing faintly in the dim light. Ortiz's dual tokens were resonating, producing a sound just below the threshold of hearing, a vibration felt in the bones rather than heard. "Begin on my mark," Kerr said, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. 3, 2, 1, mark. We spoke our door words in unison, and reality flickered like a candle flame in a draft. The transition was instantaneous, no gradual descent into sleep, no momentary disorientation. One moment we were in the cartography room. The next we stood before a door that had no frame, a portal that existed independent of any wall or structure, hanging in a void that was neither dark nor light, but something outside the spectrum of perception. The door was ivory, or perhaps bone, or perhaps compressed snow that would never melt. Set into its surface were 9 metal segments that formed a ring, each segment inscribed with symbols that shifted and rearranged themselves as we watched. Through the door, for it was somehow transparent despite being opaque, we could see a corridor lined with tablets, each one recording names and dates and dreams in scripts from every human culture, and some that had never been human at all. "The last gate," Ortiz whispered, and her voice carried absolute certainty. "This is what everything else has been preparing us for." Behind us, though there had been nothing behind us a moment before, stood every entity we had encountered: the ledger bearer, the Dais Ward, the circle keeper, and dozens of others that existed in the periphery of our records, mentioned but never directly witnessed. They weren't threatening, weren't advancing. They were simply present, waiting, as if our arrival at this door was an event they had been anticipating for longer than the Institute had existed. The door began to open, not swinging on hinges but dilating like an iris, revealing the corridor beyond. And at the far end of that corridor, on a dais that seemed both infinitely distant and immediately present, sat a book that was every book, a ledger that contained every dream ever dreamed and every dream that would ever be dreamed, and standing beside it, I felt Kerr pulling the leash, felt Dyer's voice calling return counts through dimensions of distance, felt the cartography room trying to reassert its claim on our consciousness. But the door was still opening, and through it came a knowledge that wasn't words or images, but pure understanding.
that dreams were the medium through which certain necessary transactions occurred, that witnesses were required to maintain the stability of these transactions, that the Institute had been founded not to study this phenomenon but to provide it with the documentation it required. The choice was simple and terrible: refuse and let the gates open randomly into unprepared minds, or accept and become permanently bound to the function of witnessing, of maintaining the record that kept the boundaries stable. The ivory door hung before us in that nowhere space, its 9 metal segments catching light that had no source. My ledger had already filled 3 pages with diagrams of its construction, cutaway views showing mechanisms that existed in more dimensions than the paper could properly represent, annotations in my handwriting describing materials that had no names in any human language, compressed possibility, crystallized observation, the metal that remembers when it was stone. Through the door's impossible transparency, I could see the corridor of tablets stretching beyond, each one inscribed with the history of dreams that had crossed from sleeping to waking. Names I recognized from our archives: Jeremiah Orne, whose dreams of the 7 pillars had initiated the Salem investigations; Elias Marsh, who had brought something back from the glass bridge that transformed Kingsport's waterfront into angles that fish swam through as if they were water; Margaret Tillinghast, still writing in the sanitarium, her ledgers filling themselves with descriptions of a city that existed in the gaps between seconds. The entities surrounding us maintained their patient vigil. The ledger-bearer stood foremost, its form more solid here than I had ever seen it, revealing details that my mind struggled to process: skin that was also parchment, eyes that were also inkwells, hands that existed simultaneously as writing and written. Behind it, the Dais Ward shuffled through ribbons of text that emerged from its chest and returned through its spine, an endless loop of documentation documenting itself. The Circle Keeper remained at the periphery, its child form a mockery that made my teeth ache, contracts scrolling across its face in languages that predated human speech but somehow remained legible, terms of service for reality itself. "The junction requires completion," the ledger-bearer said, and its voice carried the weight of every word ever written in Dream. "The previous carrier has dissolved into pure documentation. A successor must be authenticated, or the gates will seek their own solutions." I felt my companion's presence through the strange acoustics of dream space. Marbury stood at the 7 pillars, but also beside me, his consciousness stretched across multiple anchor points like light through a prism. Ortiz had positioned herself at the intersection of 3 paths, her dual tokens allowing her to exist in a
state of controlled superposition. In the waking world, Kerr maintained his grip on our leashes while Dyer monitored equipment that was never designed to measure what it was now recording. The corridor behind the door began to shift, tablets rearranging themselves to show not just the past, but the future. Entries dated tomorrow, next week, next year. I saw my own name recurring with increasing frequency, attached to locations that didn't yet exist in our charts. The inverse cathedral, where architecture existed as negative space carved from solid reality. The Latitude Keeper's Observatory, positioned at the angle where parallel lines meet. The archive of unwritten words, containing every thought that almost became language, but dissolved before reaching expression. "Show me the previous carrier," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. The ledger-bearer gestured to the furthest tablet. Upon it was carved a name I knew from the Institute's founding documents: Silas Whitmarsh, first director of Oneiric studies, who had disappeared in 1924 during what the official records called a deep transit event. But here was the truth. He hadn't disappeared. He had become the function itself. His consciousness spread across every dream path like water absorbed into sand, maintaining the connections through pure will until that will itself dissolved into process. 5 years he held the function, the ledger-bearer said. Before him, the witch woman of Dunwich for 7.
Before her, a Narragan set dream speaker for 3 generations as your kind counts time. The chain stretches back to when your ancestors first learned to mark their visions on cave walls, creating the first roads between sleeping and waking. The continuance ledger materialized on the dais at the corridor's end, not appearing, but having always been there once I looked for it. Its pages were blank, yet somehow already full, containing every possible future depending on who signed their name as witness. I could see, with the peculiar clarity that comes only in dreams, the branching possibilities. If I refused, within 6 months, untrained dreamers across New England would begin opening gates without protocol, their unguided transits causing reality to develop stress fractures. Buildings would gain rooms that existed only when no one looked for them. Streets would form loops that led backward through time. The boundary between metaphor and material would collapse entirely. But if I accepted, the carrier maintains function but loses freedom, the ledger bearer said, answering my unspoken question. Every dream becomes duty. Every sleep brings transit. The patterns must be walked, the records must be kept, the witnesses must be guided. You will age in dreams while your body remains suspended in time. You will know every path but walk them alone, present at every anchor but belonging to none. Marbury's voice reached me across dimensional barriers. The mathematics don't
support refusal. Look at the recursion patterns. He was right. Kerr's calculations had shown it clearly. The system required a conscious observer to maintain stability. Without one, the accumulated dreams of centuries would collapse into the present moment like a breaking dam. Every nightmare ever dreamed would become equally real as every waking moment. The categories that kept experience navigable would dissolve. But there must be limits, Ortiz said from her intersection point. Even carriers must operate within boundaries. The ledger bearer extended the stone ledger, and I saw that she was right. The carrier's function came with its own protocols, its own restrictions. The carrier could open and close paths but not create new ones, could guide witnesses but not compel them, could maintain the record but not alter what had already been written. It was a position of vast responsibility but limited authority, a cosmic clerk managing files that happened to be the substrate of reality. Through the waking world, I felt Dyer's medical equipment registering anomalies. My body's temperature had dropped 3 degrees. My heartbeat had synchronized with some deeper rhythm that the machines couldn't properly measure. My hands had begun writing without nervous system involvement, filling page after page with coordinates and equations that described the topology of spaces that shouldn't exist. If I refuse, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Another will be chosen, less prepared, less protected. The Institute will continue its search, losing custodians to madness or worse until someone accepts out of ignorance rather than understanding. The gates care nothing for consent, only function. The corridor fractured then, not breaking but multiplying, showing me every path simultaneously. The 7 pillars stood in their eternal plaza while also dissolving into component atoms. The glass bridge flowed in its perpetual paradox while shattering into infinite fragments. Every dream ever recorded in the Institute's archives manifested at once, a crushing weight of accumulated experience that threatened to collapse into a singularity of pure documentation. I saw other custodians across time, each facing this same choice. Some had refused and lived to regret it, watching reality develop cancers of impossibility that no medicine could cure. Others had accepted and disappeared into the function, their human identities dissolving into the role until only the role remained. A few had tried to destroy the system entirely, burning archives, killing witnesses, but the dreams simply found other outlets, other writers, other paths to manifestation. The gates existed before the Institute, I said, understanding finally arriving like a cold wind. Before any human institution. We didn't discover them, they discovered us, found in humanity the perfect recording medium, consciousness capable of observing without fully comprehending, documenting without controlling.
The ledger bearer neither confirmed nor denied, simply held out the stone ledger with its blank line waiting. Around us, the assembled entities began to speak in unison, their voices creating harmonics that made the air itself visible, revealing the underlying structure of dream space, a vast network of interconnected paths, each one a possible route between what is and what might be, all requiring maintenance, all demanding witnesses. I thought of my sister in Portland, who would receive my salary in perpetuity, the Institute's standing policy for carriers, though she would be told I had died in service. I thought of my small room with its patched wallpaper, which would be sealed and marked with the same symbols that marked the other rooms where carriers had lived before their translation. I thought of the normal life I had never quite managed to build, always feeling displaced, as if I were waiting for something without knowing what. The carrier serves until a successor is found, I said. How long? Time moves differently in the function. What feels like days to you might be years in waking. What seems like years might be moments. The previous carrier experienced 5 years as 17 lifetimes. The one before measured duration in the growth of crystals, the one before that in the decay of languages. You will serve until the service is complete. I looked at my companions, stretched across their various anchor points. Marbury nodded slowly, understanding that this was the only mathematics that balanced. Ortiz spoke a phrase in a language that predated Spanish, a blessing or a curse, or perhaps both. In the waking world, Kerr and Dyer prepared for either outcome, their instruments ready to record whatever transformation was about to occur. The pen materialized in my hand, not placed there, but having always been there once I needed it. The stone ledger lay open before me, its pages containing the compressed dreams of millennia, each entry a thread in the vast web that kept the sleeping and waking worlds from collapsing into each other. The blank line waited at the bottom of the current page, labeled simply, "Witness to the Last Gate." I thought of all the custodians who had walked these paths before me, their ledgers still filling themselves in the Institute's sealed rooms. They hadn't failed or gone mad, I realized. They had succeeded too completely, become so entangled with the documentation that they could no longer distinguish between observing and being observed, between writing and being written. If I sign, I said, I maintain authority over the protocols. The Institute continues to function as shield and filter. No untrained minds are recruited without preparation. The carrier defines the parameters within functional limits. The gates require only that someone hold the position. The method is negotiable. I set the pen to the page. The ink flowed like blood, like thought, like the darkness between stars. I wrote my name in characters that were simultaneously English, Latin, cuneiform, and something older that had never needed a name because it existed before the concept of naming. As I wrote, I felt myself changing, not transformed but revealed, as if this had always been my purpose and everything else had been preparation. The corridor solidified around me. The tablets ceased their shifting and locked into position, showing the true history of the dream paths, not discovered but negotiated, not explored but maintained, a vast infrastructure of consciousness that preceded human awareness, but had come to depend on human documentation. We were the universe's filing system, chosen not for our wisdom but for our peculiar ability to observe without understanding, to record without controlling. The signature completed itself, letters I hadn't written appearing after my name, carrier authenticated, function transferred, continuity preserved. The stone ledger closed with a sound like cathedral doors sealing. The ledger bearer stepped back, its form already beginning to fade as its purpose transferred to me. The other entities dispersed, returning to their positions throughout dream space, waiting for the next time they would be needed to test, tempt, or guide whatever witnesses I would shepherd through the paths. The continuance ledger adhered to my hands, not stuck but integrated, its binding fusing with my skin at the molecular level. Through it, I could feel every dream being dreamed at that moment across the world. a child in Boston navigating a corridor of infinite doors, a fisherman in Gloucester walking across water that was also sky, a professor at Miskatonic discovering that mathematics could be performed only in dream space where the rules were negotiable. "Return," Kerr's voice called from impossible distance. 13, 12, 11. But return was no longer simple. I existed now in multiple states, my body in the cartography room, my consciousness distributed across every anchor point, my awareness touching every dream that approached the documented paths. I could feel Marbury and Ortiz beginning their journey back, their forms condensing from probability into flesh. But I remained expanded, stretched across the entire network like morning light across water. 10, 9, 8. The continuance ledger opened itself, showing me my first assignment, a cluster of untrained dreamers in Providence who had stumbled upon the green stairwell without preparation. They were descending past the 93rd step, approaching the counterfeit path that would lead them to dissolution if not redirected. I reached out through dream space, placing warnings in their path, moss growing upward, water flowing in reverse, all the signals we had documented to mark false routes. 7, 6, 5. More tasks presented themselves. A child in Salem dreaming of 7 pillars, needing guidance before the plaza's weight crushed her unprepared mind. An elderly scholar in Dunwich whose equations had opened a door he couldn't close. A group of students at the university attempting to map dream space using untested protocols, their enthusiasm risking a breach that would merge their dormitory with the broken colonnade. 4, 3, 2. I felt my body beginning to reassert its claims, gravity and flesh demanding recognition. But the continuance ledger remained fused to my hands, its weight both infinite and weightless. Through it, I was connected to every previous carrier, their experiences layered into mine like geological strata. I knew what Silas Whitmarsh had known, what the witch woman of Dunwich had discovered, what the Narragansett dream speaker had sung into being. All their knowledge, all their burden, compressed into the eternal present moment of carrying the function. 1. I opened my eyes in the cartography room, fluorescent lights harsh after the non-light of dream space. My colleagues surrounded me, Kerr still gripping the return leash, Dyer checking vital signs, Ortiz and Marbury standing at careful distance, understanding that something fundamental had changed. In my lap, the continuance ledger rested, looking like an ordinary journal to those who couldn't see its true nature. But I could feel it breathing, its pages filling themselves with the dreams of the world, each one requiring assessment, guidance, documentation. "Edmund?" Dyer asked, his voice carefully professional despite the tremor underneath. "Are you yourself?" I considered the question. Was I myself? I was Edmund Thorne, records custodian, brother to Margaret, resident of the third-floor room with its patched wallpaper. But I was also the carrier, the one who held the function, the conscious observer that kept the dream paths stable. I was individual in role, person and position, myself and something vastly larger that had incorporated myself into its process. "I am what the function requires," I said, and heard my voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "The gates are stabilized, the protocols hold, the institute continues." Dr. Armitage entered then, having observed everything through his reinforced glass. He approached slowly, recognizing the danger of startling a newly authenticated carrier. In his hands, he held a brass plate, green with designed verdigris, bearing new symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Your office has been prepared," he said, "the sub-basement level where you can work without disturbance. Your official death certificate has been filed. Your sister will be informed of your heroic sacrifice during a catastrophic equipment failure. The Institute will continue to function as your interface with the waking world." I understood. Edmund Thorne was dead to the world above. What remained was the carrier, permanently stationed at the intersection of sleeping and waking, maintaining the infrastructure that kept the two from catastrophically merging. I would have an office where my body could rest while my consciousness traveled the paths. I would have assistants who would transcribe my reports without understanding their full significance. I would have all the resources of the Institute, but I would never again be purely human, purely individual, purely awake or asleep. The previous carriers, I asked, their ledgers that continue filling themselves? You'll find them in your office, Armitage said. They're part of the network now, subsidiary functions that you'll maintain along with everything else. Think of them as automated subroutines, handling routine documentation while you manage the greater function. I stood, the continuance ledger's weight shifting with me, already opening to show new tasks. A situation developing in Innsmouth where fishermen were dreaming in synchronization, their collective unconscious threatening to open a path to somewhere that had been intentionally sealed. A mathematician at Harvard whose proofs only worked in dream space, his equations describing geometries that could unravel if published. A child in Arkham itself, directly below us, whose nightmares were so vivid they were beginning to manifest in her waking hours, shadows under her bed that had depth, closet doors that opened onto the green stairwell. I need to begin, I said, and they understood. They led me to the sub-basement, to a room I had never known existed despite 3 years at the Institute. The walls were covered with maps like the cartography room, but these showed not just the documented paths, but all possible paths, probability clouds of routes that might open depending on who dreamed them. The previous carriers' ledgers lined the shelves, hundreds of volumes still writing themselves, their pens moving without hands, their pages turning without wind. At the center sat a desk that looked carved from a single piece of stone that absorbed light, and upon it, a chair that molded itself to my form the moment I sat. The continuance ledger opened to a blank page, and my hand began to write without conscious direction. March 1st, 1937. Carrier authenticated. Function assumed. The dream paths are stable. The gates respond to protocol. The witnesses are guided. The documentation continues. Current priority, Innsmouth synchronization event. 17 fishermen experiencing identical dreams of a sunken city rising. Probability of breach, 73%. Recommended intervention. Deploy counterfeit imagery to break synchronization. Insert architectural impossibilities that individual minds will reject differently, forcing divergence. Secondary concern. Harvard mathematician approaching proof of dream space topology. If published, equations could serve as instruction manual for untrained access. Recommended intervention. Introduce calculation error at step 347, subtle enough to pass review, but significant enough to prevent function. Tertiary issue. Arkham child manifesting nightmare entities.
Natural talent for transit without training. Potential future custodian if properly guided. Recommended intervention. Begin preliminary conditioning through guided dreams. Introduce protective imagery. Assign Institute personnel for observation. The pen continued moving, documenting responses to dreams I was simultaneously experiencing, guiding, redirecting. I was in Innsmouth, inserting false memories of different cities to break the synchronized vision. I was at Harvard, planting doubt in the mathematician's mind about a crucial assumption. I was in the child's room, teaching her through dream logic how to build walls against her own nightmares, how to turn fear into structure. Hours passed, or days, or years. Time had become negotiable, measured not in duration but in dreams, processed, paths maintained, breaches prevented. The other ledgers on the shelves wrote in harmony with mine, the previous carrier's functions now integrated into my own, their experiences accessible like memories that belonged to someone else but resided in my mind. Through it all, I remained aware of my body in the sub-basement office, aging slower than it should, sustained by something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite waking. Assistants came and went. I recognized Kerr's voice sometimes, Ortiz's hand delivering coffee that would grow cold untouched. They spoke to me, and I responded, but most of my consciousness was elsewhere, everywhere. maintaining the vast network of dreams that kept reality stable. The continuance ledger grew heavier with each entry, but also lighter, as if mass itself had become paradoxical. Its pages numbered in the thousands, but opening it always revealed the exact entry I needed to see. Through it, I could feel the pulse of collective unconscious, the rhythm of the world's sleeping minds touching the paths we had documented, guided by protocols established over centuries, refined through trial and error and sacrifice. Occasionally, I would encounter another carrier from another institute, for of course there were others, in London, in Prague, in Cairo, in cities whose names didn't translate into waking language. We would acknowledge each other across dream space, sharing the burden of maintaining boundaries that should never have needed maintaining, but had become essential once humanity developed the capacity to dream collectively. The child in Arkham grew under my guidance, her nightmares transforming into lucid explorations. By the time she was 16, she had walked the 7 pillars without fear, navigated the glass bridge by intuition rather than instruction. The Institute had already prepared her recruitment letter. She would make an excellent custodian, perhaps even a future carrier when my function finally dissolved into pure process like all the carriers before me. But that was years away, decades, centuries. Time had ceased to hold meaning in the conventional sense. I measured duration now in the accumulation of documented dreams, the slow evolution of the paths as humanity's collective unconscious shifted with the changing world. New anchors appeared as technology advanced, digital paths that existed in the dreams of programmers, quantum corridors walked by physicists whose equations touched spaces that mathematics alone couldn't access. My ledger recorded them all, integrated them into the network, established protocols for their navigation. The Institute evolved too, its methods advancing while its purpose remained constant, to serve as interface between the carrier and the waking world, to train new custodians, to maintain the fiction that dreams were merely neurological phenomena rather than the infrastructure of reality itself. And through it all, the continuance ledger remained fused to my hands, its binding now part of my skin, its pages inseparable from my consciousness. I had become what the function required, a living document, a conscious archive, a witness to the witnesses, maintaining through pure observation the boundaries that kept the world navigable. In my few moments of full waking awareness, I sometimes remembered Edmund Thorne, the man I had been before accepting the function. He seemed distant now, like a character in a story I had once read. His concerns, his debts, his sister, his small rented room belonged to a different scale of existence. Yet he remained part of me, the human core around which the carrier function had crystallized, necessary ballast that kept me from dissolving entirely into the role. The wallpaper in my office, for I had been wrong, there was wallpaper here, the same William Morris pattern as in my old room, showed no patches. It didn't need them. This room existed partially in dream space, its walls permeable to the bleed-through that would have destroyed a purely physical space. Sometimes I could see through them to the other carriers' offices stretching infinitely in all directions, not just backward through time, but forward too. The future carriers who would assume the function when I finally dispersed into pure documentation. The pen never stopped moving. Even now, as I write this account, or as it writes itself through me, the documentation continues. Every word serves dual purpose, recording what has happened while simultaneously maintaining the structure that allows it to happen. The act of witnessing creates the witnessed, the observer effect raised to cosmic significance. Somewhere above, the Institute continues its work. New custodians are recruited, trained, sent to walk the paths I maintain. Some will succeed, adding their documentation to the ever-growing archive. Some will fail, their names added to the tablets in the corridor behind the last gate. A few, a very few, will show the compatibility that marks them as potential carriers, and they will be carefully, gradually prepared for the choice that isn't really a choice at all. Because someone must hold the function, someone
must maintain the boundaries. Someone must stand at the intersection of sleeping and waking, keeping each from overwhelming the other. The gates demand witnesses, and witnesses require a witness in turn, an infinite regression of observation that terminates only in the carrier, the one who observes the observers, documents the documentation, dreams the dreams of the dreamers. The continuance ledger turns to a new page, already filled with my handwriting describing tomorrow's crises. A breach forming near Providence, a synchronization event in Boston, a child in Portland, my sister's daughter, though she doesn't know her dreams are being guided by the uncle she believes is dead, beginning to walk the paths without training. Each requires intervention, guidance, documentation. Each must be witnessed to remain stable. I reach for the pen, but it's already in my hand, has always been in my hand since the moment I signed my name at the last gate. The words flow like water, like blood, like the darkness between stars. The witness continues. The function persists. The dreams remain contained. The waking world proceeds unaware of the infrastructure that maintains its stability. This is the record. This is the testimony. This is the price of keeping the boundaries intact. And somewhere, in a small room with patched wallpaper, a new custodian lies down to dream for the first time, unaware that their every step is being watched, guided, documented by someone who was once like them but has become something else, something necessary, something terrible, something that stands between the world and the dreams that would unmake it. The pen moves, the pages fill, the witness continues. This is my function now and will be until another takes my place, adding their consciousness to the network I maintain, their awareness to the accumulated observation that keeps reality stable. We are the universe's memory of itself, written in dreams and maintained through witness, an endless documentation of the possible that keeps it from becoming actual. The continuance ledger closes, but only momentarily. Another dream requires guidance. Another path needs maintenance. Another witness must be witnessed. The work continues. The work has always continued. The work will continue after I am nothing but another self-writing ledger on the shelf, my consciousness dispersed into the function, my name added to the tablets in the corridor behind the last gate, where all carriers eventually return, not as individuals, but as part of the process itself, the eternal documentation that keeps the sleeping and waking worlds from discovering they were never separate at all.